There is your notice that we are officially recording, as this is a two-party consent state. You have been notified. If you do not consent to being recorded, please log off. So we're going to be talking about buyer agency today. And each month we go over different contracts and scenarios. This month's contract is the buyer agency. But buyer agency is more than just a form. It's a concept and it's a practice. And as we know, things have been changing a little bit. So we may have to roll with the punches here a little bit. But what I want to emphasize to you is that if you go out and you do what we should have been doing all along, your changes are going to be minimal, just little tweaks here and there. And we'll talk about that. So let's start off. I'm going to break this all into basically three parts. One, I'm going to just do a real quick recap on the NAR settlement. I mean, I'm not even going to go in depth on that. I'm just going to touch on it. Two, we're going to talk about the contract. And three, we're going to hit up the value that you bring as a buyer's agent. Typically, I'd like to spend about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes max during these sessions. This one might run a little bit longer. If there's a consensus amongst everybody and we get bored during the contract, we might be able to break this down into two sessions, but I'm going to rely on all you guys to tell me when you've had enough. So feel free to tap out. I'll be looking at your eyes to see when you've glazed over. So has everyone been saturated with hype on the NAR settlement? I have a folder in my email set up that every time I get an email on the NAR settlement, I just slide it over there. I just want to see how many I can get. We've got a pretty substantial pile of things going on right now. The one that you should, well, there's a couple that we should be looking to for guidance, resources wise. One's going to be the, NAR. NAR is going to give us fact sheets and updates. They have a website out there right now. It's called the Facts for Realtors. It's a page. If you go to nar.realtor/thefacts, it's going to give you up-to-date breakdowns of what's going on with the commission lawsuits. There's a few webinars recorded on there. There's a few statements, some letters to government agencies asking for clarifications.
Is he here in this office? He's at home. Oh.
I'm going to mute you. One of the big questions that many of us have is, what's going to happen to the underrepresented buyer, the person who doesn't have the money to pay a buyer's agent commission? What about the veteran who is not allowed under VA guidelines to pay a commission even if they wanted to or could afford to? And that's, you'll see under nar.realtor/thefacts, where the Mortgage Brokers Association or the Mortgage Lenders Association of the United States and NAR are writing letters to government agencies to find out what can be done and do they have plans to make changes to these guidelines. So even NAR, who is party to this settlement, doesn't have all the details yet. And that's the point I want to get across to you, is that the settlement is not final. It cannot be finalized until the court approves it. And the court's not going to approve it until all the stakeholders check off on whether this meets their needs. So give it a minute. More guidelines will come. Now, we can't implement changes to our best practices until the settlement is final and guidance is given. So when the NAR settlement is finally ratified by the court and all the stakeholders involved, then guidance will be given at the NAR level to each of the state associations. PAR, as I have said before, is well ahead of the curve when it comes to buyer agency representation and the forms that keep us in compliance and have kept us by and large out of this whole lawsuit mess. So we're already 90% of the way there with PAR. We're just looking for the tweaks that we need to do. And the Standard Forms Committee is on call and ready to go to make those changes. So that's the other resource that we're going to be looking to is PAR. So we're watching NAR, but we're really looking for PAR to tell us how we're supposed to practice, because our licenses are Pennsylvania licenses, right? And then we're going to look to our local associations because they're going to put out information. And in some of our markets, the local association is also the local MLS, and those things work together to tell us how, we're going to be operating. So stay tuned, everybody. Don't panic. Just do what we have been doing, because even if we wanted to implement changes or best practices right now, we can't, because they haven't been authorized by the higher authorities, being NAR, the PAR, the Real Estate Commission. So let's focus on what we can do and what we can do well. I've mentioned that we are 90% of the way there because of Pennsylvania policy, Pennsylvania forms, but also because of our policy as a brokerage, as a team of brokerages, and our policies. We've been annoying you all for years with our requirement for the cooperating broker compensation form, and this is one of the reasons. We've seen this thing coming. We operate in multiple MLSs, and we just want to make sure that everyone's communicating clearly. That's the form that we're most likely going to be using in the future. It's already second nature to you folks, so you should be ahead of the curve with regard to that practice in the future. So we're going to focus on what we can do. We're going to do it well, and then we're going to find, whenever the guidance comes out, that we only have minor tweaks to employ, changes to our dialogues, etc. So let's build on the foundation we have, and let's look at the contract. Bear with me as I teach myself to screen share again. Every time I get up here to do it, I'm trying to figure out what I'm doing. Okay, as far as resources right now, you should be looking at the nar.realtor/the facts. Can you sound off? Give me a thumbs up. Say, yeah, that's what I'm seeing. Okay, thanks, Susan.
Yep.
2, when we're working with the contract, what I want you all to focus on is the resources that we have all grown up with, the resources that I use when I advise you. We're going to go to parealtors.org. parealtors.org. And why I like this is you can type in something simple like buyer agency, and it gives you a whole host of topics to investigate. You're going to have to log in using your login, your NRDS number, and then whatever password you set up. And then this walks us through the contracts that we use. It gives us industry news regarding that topic, legal issues, association news from PAR, stuff from government affairs. So this is going to touch on everything to do with that subject. If you want to learn more about buyer agency, this is where you go. If you are having glitches with your forms library, you can go right here. Not what I was looking to do. Went to the wrong one. Give me a second. Go to the buyer agency contract. and you'll be able to download your buyer agency contract right from PAR. What I really want you to know is that you have these guidelines. There's guidelines for every single document that we're going to use for every family of documents. Sometimes the forms are so close that they only put out one set of guidelines for multiple versions, but for buyer agency, there's a very detailed guideline. So we're going to touch on that here in just a moment. And then also in PAR, if you type in buyer agency contract, you'll see great things like this right here, a resource, which is Hank Lerner and Al Perry, the outgoing president, talking about changes that they foresee. So if you want up-to-date information, PAR is a great resource, as well as NAR, and closer to home. So I think more accurate information. So let's head right into what I want to talk about and what most of you probably have never toyed with before. I don't know how useful this is going to be in the future. It could become super useful. It could become useless, depending on what changes come down. But it's in our forms library now, and it's not a bad idea to become familiar with it. Why? Because one of the settlement elements is that we'll have to have a signed agreement with a buyer before we show them a property. We don't know exactly what that entails. That could be a signed consumer notice. That could be a signed buyer agency agreement. And with what we know about buyer agency agreements, they can be for one house, one day, 1 week, a month, or a year. No longer than a year, though. And that contract is going to tie us to the client as well as the client to us. As sound off, give me a thumbs up, head nod, whatever. Who was able to participate in yesterday's panel? Anybody check that out? I thought it was fantastic, because we got to hear exactly from the consumer what's important to them. And, you know, you can listen to me talk all day, but whenever we hear it from the consumer, I think that that makes a real difference. And one of the things that the three consumers that we talked with yesterday, they had different needs. So having flexibility in these forms is important. We had an investor who expects to spend, 2 days, 2 full days, seeing 6 to 8 properties before making a choice. And then we had the homeowner looking for their forever home, who spent 3 years looking for a property with Chris Deerdorf before finding one that met all of their needs. So he had to go through several times and reauthorize this buyer agency agreement. But the non-exclusive buyer agency agreement is a low bar to entry that locks up your right to any seller paid commission on a property, and only that property. They can, this is the dating form. This isn't the marriage form. This will get you in the door and guarantee your efforts for the day and for any other properties that you see, but not necessarily in general. If they wander off and buy a for sale by owner, they go to another county, another association, another MLS and buy a property, you have no rights to that commission. And on some level, I agree with that and think that's the way it, it doesn't bother me. This does not require signatures. Okay, so there's additional terms that may be put in here for compensation. At the top, it talks about time frames right here. It talks about who's involved. And then there's general terms to it, including dual agency, designated agency, etc. it gets all of our basic required disclosures out of the way. But here's the neat part at the bottom. It says this is, with the checking of this, let me blow this up a little bit. It says this agreement was reached orally between the broker and whoever on what and what date, with a copy provided to the buyer, and this document serves as a written memorandum of the terms of the agreement, and because it is an oral agreement, no signatures are required. By allowing broker to show buyer properties, the buyer agrees to the terms of this agreement. So you meet somebody, agents are always afraid to push too hard, right? You don't want to scare them off. This might be that low drag, easy kind of low bar to entry dating form. Now, this is the interactive part. Can anyone see the benefit in this? Talk to me. Give me a shout out. Say, yes, I can see how this might be useful. Does anybody have a one free ride policy? You know, I have that policy. I'll meet you at the property. That's an interview. I don't know if I like you yet. I don't know if I want to be locked into a relationship with you for 6 months or a year. This might be a perfect arrangement. The client feels the same way. They don't know anything about you. Are they going to sign a form before they even go into a property, before they know if you're going to be pushy and try and get them to buy the first house? Are you going to explain away fundamental material defects with that property just to get a sale? They don't know you or what you do or how you do your business. So this might put them at ease to guarantee your interest and your time in showing them this first property and get them acquainted with you. I think that's the value of this form. To learn more, simply go to parealtors.org and pull down the guidelines for preparation and use of the Pennsylvania Association of Realtors non-exclusive buyer agency. That's the PAR NBA form. Check it out and see what you have to see what you like about it. Can anybody tell me, does anybody know this form and can tell me what's not great about it?
Does this protect the buyer's
without
confidentiality?
signatures, without a written agreement, you cannot charge your client a fee. So you can lock them into that commission that's being paid by the seller, right? You have this non-exclusive. This tracks your procuring cause. However, if commission isn't being paid or it does not meet your minimum commission, this will not cover any additional broker fee. Okay? So this is a very minimal protection for you, but does not rise to the level that we will generally need in the future, I believe. Questions on that before we move on from the NBA? You can tell there's lots of fun stuff to talk about because there are 7 and a smidge pages on a 2-page document. So let's go on to the buyer agency contract that we all know and love. Why do we have to put the company license here? So they can know who they call if we behave badly. Why do we need our own state license number on here?
Same reason.
Also, who to pin the blame on, and it's a federal banking requirement. The bankers usually want to know that. That's why it goes on the agreement of sale. But it's just being thorough, right? They want to know who to call if things go sideways. I'd like to have the buyer's name on here, as well as the buyer's mailing address, their phone number, their email, their fax number. Remember, you have already been through the consumer notice with the person at this point. That's the first brick in your foundation of professionalism. This is the next layer up. The more thorough you are, the more professional it makes you appear. I describe this when talking to my clients as my employment agreement. This allows me to work on your behalf and negotiate for you. With the signing of this agreement, we are forging a fiduciary relationship, which means that I am your servant, basically, that I am obligated with the signing of this agreement to represent your best interests at every turn. So, starting and ending dates of the buyer agency contract. Says right here that no association has set a recommended term of this contract. In addition to saying what a standard commission is, I think we should probably shy away from saying what a standard term of employment is, only that it can't exceed 1 year. And that this contract can't be extended without the written consent of the buyer. But if you are under contract, this contract ends upon settlement. Okay? Can we think of any reason why this starting date is going to be future dated? Well, they may have a pre-existing contract with somebody else and they're just waiting for that clock to tick down. As we had one of our panelists remark yesterday, if they don't like that agent, they will wait until hell freezes over to make sure that they do not work with them in the acquisition of a property. We have seen this numerous times. I have from my seat when dealing with issues out, amongst you guys. Here's something that we need to look at. Line number 14 of the agreement. Does the buyer have a buyer agency contract with another broker? Yes or no? Technically, we shouldn't be filling these things out in advance of having them sign them. Typically we go and, sign this stuff, whip it off to them via DocuSign or .loop, and they didn't have any chance to give their input onto whether this yes or no was bona fide. So we should be asking them at some point, prior to sending this to them, are you working with another agent? And by working with another agent, do you have a buyer agency contract with another broker, yes or no? If yes, please explain. Maybe they have a buyer agency contract that says that they will work with so-and-so only in Erie County or Armstrong County or someplace out west, that gives them the freedom to work with somebody in the eastern or central part of the state. Maybe they have a relationship with somebody in Florida, but we should get clarification here. Questions, comments, stories, any past train wrecks? Okay. Broker's fee. No association of realtors has set or even recommended the broker's fee. The broker and the buyer have negotiated the fee, and the broker will receive for exercising professional knowledge and skills in locating and assisting the buyer in the acquisition of real property, which is available and suitable for the buyer. That sounds almost like a script, right? If we're taking care to describe this contract to our clients, we don't need much else other than to walk them through this. What are you going to do for me? Well, I'm going to use my professional knowledge and skills, and I'm going to locate a property for you, and I'm going to assist you in acquiring that property. Broker's fee paid by buyer to the broker is as follows. And it's this next clause that really kept us out of a lot of trouble with the 30, 40, whatever lawsuits that were sweeping the nation. Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. I just got a text that I was muted. So in a purchase transaction with a seller represented by a real estate broker, the fee is X amount of the purchase price, or so 3% or $3,000, whichever is greater, plus $395 or whatever. With a seller who is not represented by a real estate broker, the fee is X amount. I can see this being 3 or 2.5 or whatever you decide is appropriate on a transaction where another broker is involved, because there's somebody else handling another side of the transaction. I prefer to charge 4% when I'm the only agent involved, because there's going to be stuff that I'm doing for the other party regardless, right? If you can get it, go for it. Set your own value, know your value, and stick to it. The broker's fee in event of a lease transaction, typically we don't fill that out too much. That's kind of a separate one, or if you're using this as a tenant representation form. So what do you charge someone to find them a rental? $10,000, because it's a horrible pain in the neck. I'm kidding. But it is the broker's policy to accept compensation offered by the listing broker. I'm not going to turn that away. If the amount received from the listing broker is less than the amount listed above, the buyer will pay the broker the difference, unless the seller agrees to pay the difference as a term of the agreement of sale. Side note, there's a separate form for that too. So, how do we have this conversation with our folks? My wife expects me to bring home 3% of every property I sell as fair trade for the time I spend away from her and my children. Usually gets a chuckle. We move on. The balance of the broker's fee is earned if the buyer enters into an agreement of sale during the term of this contract, whether brought about by the broker, the broker's licensee, or by any other person, including the buyer. If the buyer defaults on the terms of an agreement of sale, the broker's fee will be paid by buyer to broker at that time. The buyer is advised that contacting a listing broker or seller directly may compromise the broker's ability to earn compensation from a listing broker and could result in buyer's obligation to pay a fee to the broker. To make sure that wording is ignored, it is usually placed in bold print. Or it seems that way, because this is one of the most important things that we should be covering with our clients, and it seems like nobody has ever heard of it. Because those are the people I'm talking to. They want out of their agreement because they found the property. Any questions or stories or train wrecks on that? You guys hear me all right, Chad? Now, if a buyer enters into an agreement of sale for a property after the ending date of this contract, the buyer will pay the broker's fee if this is not number 1, number 2, or number 3, but and. The agreement of sale is a result of the broker's actions during the term of this contract, well, or the property was seen during the terms of this contract, and the buyer is not under an exclusive agency contract with another broker at the time the buyer enters into the agreement. This mirrors very closely a very similar clause in the listing agreement, doesn't it? Now, dual agency. My beliefs on dual agency are this, that you can't just walk into dual agency in a typical situation. If I have a property listed and somebody calls on that sign and says, Justin, please show me that amazing opportunity at 302 Fairview Street, I'm not representing them as a buyer's agent. That's my listing. I have a pre-existing, long-standing relationship built on trust with the seller. For me to offer the same level of representation to someone who just walked into my real estate store as I do my employer would be a slap in the face to my employer. And it gets sticky should things go sideways, because now I have to fight as strongly for the person I don't know, as the person who hired me. And that's a very difficult position to be in. Now, that does not change my ability to prepare a contract for that buyer. They're just an unrepresented buyer. And as I disclose to them, this does not change my obligation to deal honestly and openly and in good faith with them. I just can't offer the same level of representation to that buyer as I do to the seller, because in this situation, I work for the seller. Now, if I have a pre-existing relationship with this buyer as well, I've shown them properties before, I've sold them properties, and it's just a coincidence that I get a listing in the same area that they might be interested in, that's a true dual agency situation, and I have to talk that over with both folks. Todd, I have Heather, and Heather's been looking for a house, and I think that yours might work. Are you okay with me showing that to them? And if he says yes, we're off to the races. If he says no, then we're going to designate another agent. If he says yes, then my job is to do no harm to either party by my representation to the other. Now, any questions on designated agency or dual agency? Designated agency, I didn't mean to skip ahead there. Designated agency means that you work for that client to the exclusion of all others in your brokerage. In the old days, if Susan signed a listing contract with a client, then everybody in that office was also representing them as a client. That was before buyer agency. We don't do it that way anymore. It means that Susan's client is Susan's client, Steph's client, Steph's client, Kyle's client is Kyle's client, and nobody else represents them except for me. So you work for them to the exclusion of all others. Now, broker services to others. The broker may not take action that is inconsistent with the buyer's interests. However, the broker may provide services to a seller for which the broker may accept a fee. Such services may include, but are not limited to, listing property for sale, representing the seller as a seller's agent, deed prep, document prep, ordering certifications for closing, financial services, That's like hooking them up with a lender, title transfer and preparation services. So hook them up with a title company, ordering insurance, pointing them in the direction of repair services or inspection services, or providing such services in itself is not a breach of the buyer's fiduciary responsibility to that buyer. As I always describe it, in a scheme to feed my family, I try to have more than one client. The broker and the licensee may show the same properties to other buyers and may represent those buyers in attempts to purchase the same property that the buyer wishes to purchase. And the broker does not breach a duty to a buyer by showing a property the buyer is interested in to other prospective buyers. I get that question a lot. What if I have multiple clients who want to write on the same property? According to this, it's okay. However, it's a good idea to have discussed that with your client before they find out through the grapevine that you wrote the offer that beat them. Now, it is a conflict of interest when the broker or the licensee has a financial or personal interest in the property, or cannot put the buyer's interest before any other. If the broker or any of the broker's licensees has a conflict of interest, the broker will notify the buyer in a timely manner. So, let's read that a little bit closer. If I have a conflict of interest, that means my financial involvement in a property, I need to let that client know as soon as possible. But it also says, if the broker or any of the broker's licensees has a conflict of interest, the broker will notify the buyer in a timely manner. So if there is a flip or a property that is owned by one of your co-agents in your office, it's a good idea to mention it, because we would hate for that to go sideways and your loyalties be called into question. So that's a very interesting kind of paragraph there. Any questions on conflicts of interest or representing multiple buyers on the same property? Super. This contract is all enforceable. Any changes need to be done in writing. Transfer this contract. Buyer agrees that the broker may transfer this contract to another broker if we go out of business, if we join with another company, or we sell the property or sell the business. Don't foresee that happening, so you should be good to go. But we have to put that in writing should it occur. Say if I get hit by a bus. Anybody know the time frame that you would have to notify your clients of a replacement of a broker if I get hit by a bus? 2 weeks. 2 weeks. I have to be incapacitated or dead, and you have to notify them. We have to have a replacement broker. Actually, I think it's 72 hours if I'm dead. It's 2 weeks if I'm incapacitated. So, not you in Williamsport. You've got Julie. You're fine. Confidentiality. Unless permitted by the buyer or required by law, the broker will not knowingly reveal or use any confidential information of the buyer. And the buyer understands that the seller or the seller representatives might not treat the existence, terms, or conditions of any offer as confidential unless there is a confidentiality agreement. So, if I write an offer on a $200,000 property and submit it, that listing agent, are they allowed to disclose the amount of that offer to somebody else? According to this, yes. Also, confidentiality. It survives expiration of this contract. Once you owe confidentiality to somebody, that confidentiality exists forever. Just because you're not working with them anymore, you can't talk their business all over town. You still need to protect that. Here's an important one. This is enforceable by, let's see, what legislation governs this contract? Anybody have an idea? My partner Christie's favorite word. RELRA, the Real Estate Licensing and Registration Act, RELRA. I think that's Act 47. That governs this contract, but this is also governed by the Code of Ethics and the expertise of real estate agents in the state of Pennsylvania. Real estate agents are required to be licensed by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and are obligated to disclose adverse factors about a property that are reasonably apparent to someone with expertise in the marketing of real estate. Like, that's a Federal Pacific box. If you know what those are, you need to tell them. That looks like a termite. You know, if there's something you know, you're supposed to disclose it. If a buyer wants information regarding specific conditions or components of a property which are outside the broker's or the licensee's area of expertise, the buyer is encouraged to seek the advice of an appropriate professional. Somebody give me a for instance.
You see water stains on the,
Sue, you're muted.
this. Oh,
I think. Sue, you're muted.
okay, I'm here now. Can you hear me?
Okay. My for instance, can anyone hear Sue talking?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay,
I
good.
can't.
I hear her.
Okay, so you go in and you're showing a
I
house
have a
and
problem. Can you put it in the comments?
Sure.
Yeah, we can all hear you, Sue. He just can't.
I think I'm having some technical issues here. Water stains on the ceiling, roof leak, how extensive? Exactly, Sue. That's one good for instance. I don't know what the cause of that damage is, so I'm not going to speculate. What about if they ask, is that farm behind the property ever going to be developed? Nope. Don't say no. Don't say, say yes if you do know, but there's people that we would call about the future plans of that. We can go to the zoning officer. What are the tax implications of the sale of this property? I'm not a CPA, but in my experience, if this is a primary residence, as long as you live here a certain amount of time, you're not going to have capital gains. If you're holding this as an investment, totally different story. So if there's tax implications, I'm not a CPA. If there's legal ramifications, I'm not an attorney. If there's construction questions, I'm not a builder. So if the buyer wants financial, legal, or any other advice, the buyer is encouraged to seek the services of an accountant, a lawyer, or other appropriate professional. Capiche? Now, deposit money. Deposit money is usually what we fight about when we fight. In a lot of cases, that's if a deal falls apart before it goes to closing. If a deal gets sour after closing, then we're talking about disclosure issues. But deposit money, the broker is going to keep or give to a listing broker who's going to hold on to all deposit monies that the broker or the licensee receives in an escrow account as required by the real estate licensing laws and regulations until the sale is completed or an agreement of sale is terminated, or the terms of a prior written agreement between the buyer and seller have been met. Now, here's the important part that's in your agreement that sometimes we forget. It says the buyer and seller may name a non-licensee as the escrow holder, in which case the escrow holder will be bound by the terms of the escrow agreement, but not by RELRA. The buyer agrees that the person keeping the deposit monies may wait to deposit any uncashed check that is provided as deposit monies until the seller has accepted an offer. Now, regardless of the apparent entitlement to deposit monies, this is what I call the good, the bad, and the ugly. In a good situation, that money goes on behalf of the buyer towards the settlement of the property. In a bad situation, they exercise some contingency that's protected by the agreement of sale. But in an ugly situation, there's some dispute as to the entitlement to that earnest money deposit, in which case it has to be hammered out through mediation or negotiation or litigation. If you haven't been down that road, try to skip it. Civil Rights Act. This is in here as a reminder and a cue for you to remind your clients that you're going to do the right thing because you're a good person, because you believe in the equality of all the people that we serve, and it's a matter of law. And sometimes these things, doing the right thing hides, right? So the Civil Rights Act, federal and state law makes it illegal for a seller, a broker, or anyone else to use race, color, religion, religious creed, sex, or disability, familial status, age, old people like me over 40, national origin, use, or handling of support or guide animals, or the fact of a relationship or association to an individual known to have a disability as a reason for discriminating, refusing to sell, show, or rent properties. And what happened to me was we had a property listed, and the seller said, upon receiving an offer from a group home, that they couldn't do that to their neighbors. They couldn't do that. And I had to remind him, I said, Dave, what if that was your sister or your brother, your nephew, your son, your parent, that this was their only chance of having a glimpse at a normal life? This is important to them. And not only is it the right thing to do, it's legally obliged that you can't refuse to sell them this property because their disabilities are a protected class. So be aware. And that's not something that, just jumps up and says Civil Rights Act, but ask yourself those questions. And then there's the much more obvious things, the nasty things that clients say. Shut that down immediately. Don't be a party to that, okay, guys? Now, notice regarding convicted sex offenders, share with them the website. I typically don't get too involved with that. I usually say, if you want to know where the bad guys live, go check it out. Now, buyer inspections. This is important because, otherwise you're going to wind up with somebody's Uncle Bob trying to do a home inspection and picking the place apart, manufacturing, material defects, whatever. But unless a buyer and seller agree otherwise, the real estate is sold in its present condition. Everyone fails to, remember that when something comes up after the settlement and they elected not to do inspections, right? It's being sold in the present condition. It's the buyer's responsibility to determine whether the condition of the property is satisfactory. It's not the seller's job. It's not the agent's job. It's the buyer's responsibility to determine whether that property is okay for them. The buyer is advised to carry out an inspection. at the buyer's expense by qualified professionals. I'm dealing with an absolute train wreck of a transaction closed some months ago right now, where these people were just so overwhelmed with the contract or with life or whatever that they decided not to do inspections on the property. And now they're trying to come back on our brokerage and our agent because they were just in it for the money in their mind. And I know that's not the case, because this is a caring, compassionate agent who has been beside herself on how this is all shaken out. But these people were too overwhelmed. And if there's one thing I can tell you to help you guys out is slow down the transaction when you see your people freaking out and explain to them what's going on. Let them know that you're in their corner and that they need to proceed with caution, especially when septics are involved. Recordings on the property, this typically doesn't apply to us very much. It just says that we can't really be recording things, right? I always assume that somebody's watching or listening, but they can't be recorded. Buyers should be aware that the seller's property may contain smart home technologies or devices which may record or allow for remote monitoring of the seller's property. Has anybody had that happen? Yeah. So if you're in the property, be considerate with your critique, because it could come back to bite you. The buyer releases all brokers and their licensees for anything that happens because of this. So you got your catch-all there, but it still doesn't help. And the recovery fund. Anybody tell me how they explain the recovery fund? I say that the recovery fund exists should you be taken advantage of by any real estate professional, obviously not me, and you take them to court, and then you win in court, you will receive a judgment against that real estate professional, and then you find out that that real estate professional is penniless. Well, you can take that judgment to the recovery fund and they will make you whole. There's twofold satisfaction there. One being they can't practice real estate until they pay off the recovery fund, and two, you get the money. So that's how that works. Give me 1 second here. I'm going to try and reconfigure my audio so that I can try and talk with you guys.
Recording in progress.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Awesome.
How about now? A lot of echo, a lot of feedback. All right. Any questions on the contract?
Yeah, can you give me an idea of what you would put in the section on the last page? Can you scroll down to the last page? Right there under additional terms. Thank you.
I typically don't put stuff in there. That might have to do with expectations that you want to set with the client.
Okay, thank you.
Such as I don't know, times of availability or showing. Okay. I'm going to step back here. I'm going to step back here and we're going to talk about value that you can bring to the client. Do you guys want to continue on, or should we break it down and do the value that you bring and what you do as the agent? Should we do that in a separate session on another day? Your call. Do it now? All right, great. So I'm going to break it back out. The Bright MLS. Are you guys hearing an echo?
Justin, I'm seeing two of you.
Yeah, he has a cell phone.
I had to do that because of the volume. The speakers on my computer here are screwed up.
No echo now, Justin, unless probably mute your cell phone, maybe.
Won't let me.
Oh,
So if you want to communicate, just put it in the chat.
maybe as an admin.
And I'm going to jump
mute
into
yourself.
a buyer's value presentation that Bright put together. Bright MLS doesn't cover all of us, but what they do is cover 90,000 agents. So they have enough sampling size that they can tell us trends that extend beyond their market and cover the entire Mid-Atlantic. And that's what I like about Bright. They have the capability of doing that. So I'm going to jump into a share right now and